Imagine yourself stepping back more than 2 centuries into the heart of the American frontier. It is the year 1812. The United States is still in its infancy, barely 3 decades after the Declaration of Independence. Illinois, not yet a state, but a rugged and growing territory, is a place of promise and hardship. Families struggle to survive against disease, unpredictable weather, and scarce resources. For many settlers, life is less about comfort and more about endurance. Children are born into homes that often cannot provide enough food, security, or even basic care. In such circumstances, small community-led childcare homes began to emerge, places meant to give shelter, hope, and some stability to the youngest and most vulnerable. But in the summer of 1812, within one such home in Illinois, something unthinkable happened. What was intended as a refuge of safety turned into the site of one of the most devastating tragedies in early American history. A single summer claimed the lives of 45 children. Children whose laughter, cries, and futures disappeared into silence. Today, very few people know about this event. It is not taught in schools. It is rarely mentioned in history books. It lies buried under the larger events of that same year. The War of 1812, the conflicts with Britain, the burning of Washington, the rise of national heroes. And yet, for the families of Illinois, this local tragedy was every bit as defining, every bit as painful as the wars and politics that raged on the national stage. This is the story of the 1812 Illinois childcare tragedy, a story not just of loss, but of neglect, survival, memory, and erasure. It is the story of children who never lived to tell their side, and of a community left shattered by grief. And it is the story of how such a staggering event could be forgotten, buried under the dust of time, until little more than whispers remain. Why tell this story now? In the age of the internet, where almost any piece of history can be rediscovered, stories like these matter more than ever. Behind every number, 45, lies 45 little lives, each with a name, a voice, and a family who once loved them. To understand their loss, we must place ourselves in their time. We must see the fragile nature of childcare in the early 1800s, the lack of medical knowledge, and the way disease swept through tight quarters like wildfire. By telling this story, we do not just honor those lost children, we also confront a timeless truth, that the smallest voices are often the easiest to silence in history. Setting the scene. America in 1812. To truly understand the tragedy, we must first understand the backdrop. America in 1812 was a country divided between East and West. On the East Coast, cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York were already bustling with commerce, culture, and politics. But on the western frontier, places like Illinois, life was raw, unpredictable, and often brutal. Illinois was not yet a state. It was a frontier territory, sparsely populated, filled with settlers carving homes out of forests and plains. Native tribes still lived throughout the region, their lives increasingly disrupted by waves of settlers. The War of 1812 would soon erupt into battles not only between Americans and the British, but also between settlers and native peoples, many of whom were forced into conflict over land and survival. In this environment, childcare was not a structured, government-supported service. It was largely left to families, churches, or small private efforts. Most parents tried to care for their children themselves, but poverty, illness, and death often left children abandoned or orphaned. In some towns, small childcare homes or orphan houses emerged, run by church groups or community volunteers. These were not the institutions we imagine today. No formal training, no doctors on hand, no funding from government. They were improvised shelters, usually overcrowded, where children slept in close quarters and food was scarce. The Illinois child care home at the center of this story was one such place. It was supposed to be a safe haven, but instead, it became a graveyard. The summer heat on the frontier was not gentle. In 1812, it was particularly harsh: sweltering heat, contaminated water sources, and outbreaks of disease. We know, from surviving medical records of that era, that illnesses such as dysentery, cholera, typhoid fever, and influenza ravaged communities. With little understanding of germs and almost no effective medicine, entire households could be wiped out in weeks. Children, with their weaker immune systems and malnourished bodies, were especially vulnerable. In the cramped and poorly ventilated childcare home, these dangers multiplied. What began as a few cases of fever soon became an unstoppable wave of illness. The number 45, why does the number matter so much? Because numbers make tragedies visible. 45 children lost is not just a statistic. It is 45 empty beds, 45 small bodies carried to graves, 45 futures erased. To put it in perspective, many frontier communities in 1812 were small, sometimes no more than 100 to 200 people in total. Losing 45 children in one summer would have felt like losing an entire generation in a single blow. For the parents and families, it meant despair. For the surviving children, it meant growing up in a town haunted by silence. And for history, it meant a tragedy so shocking that one might expect it to be etched forever into memory. Yet, it wasn't. Why was this story forgotten? Here lies the haunting question. Why have so few of us ever heard of this tragedy? The answer is complex. First, records from the early 1800s were sparse. Many frontier communities did not keep detailed birth or death certificates. Events were often passed down orally or written only in local church registers. Second, the year 1812 was dominated by the War of 1812. News, newspapers, and memory were consumed by battles, politics, and national heroes. The deaths of children in a small Illinois home simply did not make headlines. Third, tragedies involving children were often softened, hidden, or even erased from public memory. Communities sometimes chose silence, either from shame, guilt, or the inability to face such overwhelming loss. And so, as the years passed, the tragedy of the 45 children slipped into obscurity. Families moved, records were lost, and a century later, it was little more than a rumor. Today, only fragments of documentation remain, scattered in archives, forgotten newspapers, and oral history. Framing the journey in this series, we are going to dive deep into this forgotten tragedy. We will walk through the creation of the childcare home, the conditions that led to the outbreak, the summer of horror itself, the community's grief, and ultimately, the erasure of this event from American memory. We will not just talk about dates and numbers. We will reconstruct the lives of the children, the families who entrusted them to the home, and the volunteers who tried and failed to save them. This is not just a story about death. It is a story about the fragility of life, the importance of memory, and the human tendency to bury what is too painful to remember. Engaging the audience. Before we move forward, ask yourself, how many other tragedies like this have been lost to time? How many stories of children, the most innocent among us, have slipped away simply because larger historical events overshadowed them? By uncovering this one, we are not only bringing justice to the memories of those 45 children, we are also shining a light on the broader pattern of forgotten history. So stay with us as we travel back into the sweltering summer of 1812, to a small Illinois childcare home, and to a story that America forgot but must not remain buried. Because sometimes the smallest voices have the loudest lessons to teach. In the year 1812, Illinois was not the Illinois we know today. It was not yet a state, but rather a frontier territory, a place defined by its wilderness more than by its civilization. Thick forests stretched for miles, rivers carved through the land, and prairies rolled endlessly beneath an unforgiving sun. Families who had chosen to settle there were drawn by the promise of land and freedom, but that promise came at a high price. Life was grueling. Every day demanded physical labor, every season carried its own dangers, and every community had to wrestle with isolation, scarcity, and the threat of the unknown. To live in Illinois at that time was to live on the edge of survival. The population was sparse. Small settlements dotted the landscape, often no more than a handful of cabins clustered together. Neighbors lived miles apart, and traveling from one settlement to another could take days on horseback or on foot. Roads were little more than muddy trails. Rivers provided both lifelines and dangers. They offered water and transport, but they also carried disease. In such a world, survival relied not just on individual strength but on communal cooperation. Families leaned on each other, churches offered both faith and basic charity, and those with little gave whatever scraps they could to those who had even less. In these communities, children were both a joy and a burden. They were seen as blessings, a promise of future strength, more hands to work the land, more voices to carry on the family name. Yet they were also fragile, vulnerable to every shift in the weather, every infection, every lack of food. Infant mortality rates were staggering, and many families knew the grief of burying a child before their 5th birthday. It was a cruel reality of frontier life that shaped how people loved and how they mourned. In the heart of this harsh territory stood the child care home that would later become the center of one of America's forgotten tragedies. To modernize, the term child care home might conjure images of organized institutions with neat beds, trained staff, and rules. But in 1812, such homes were far from professional. They were often little more than large wooden houses or repurposed church halls, run by volunteers or by women who had lost their own children and felt called to care for others. They were meant to provide shelter for orphans, abandoned children, or those whose parents were too ill, too poor, or too overwhelmed to provide proper care. The Illinois child care home was small, yet already overcrowded by the summer of 1812. Word of its existence had spread across settlements, and families in desperate need brought their children, hoping they would find safety within its walls. For many parents, leaving their child there was not an act of abandonment, but of survival. They hoped the child might find food, companionship, and a chance to live. In truth, however, conditions were far from ideal. Resources were scarce, and so was knowledge. The women running the home did what they could, but they lacked training, medical understanding, and often even enough clean water to keep the children healthy. Imagine a room filled with dozens of children, their ages ranging from toddlers barely able to walk to older children who had just begun to work in the fields. Before being placed in the home, they shared beds or lay on pallets on the floor. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, illness, and unwashed bodies. Meals were simple: bread, cornmeal, sometimes beans or pork if it was available. Clean water was difficult to come by, and what water they did drink often carried invisible poisons in the form of bacteria and parasites. At night, the cries of the youngest mingled with the coughing of the sick. To anyone walking in, it might have seemed less a home and more a desperate refuge, teetering on the edge of collapse. And yet, this was considered progress. In many frontier towns, there was nothing at all for children who were left without support. To have even a single building dedicated to caring for dozens of young lives was a miracle in its own right. Parents who could not afford to feed their children still clung to hope that within these walls their sons and daughters might find a fighting chance at survival. That fragile hope, however, would soon be shattered. Illinois in 1812 was also a place marked by tension. War loomed in the background, the War of 1812 against Britain, but its impact on the frontier was indirect. While cannons thundered hundreds of miles away, frontier families fought quieter battles against hunger, disease, and loneliness. For them, war was not the flash of muskets, but the absence of fathers and sons who left to fight. War was the uncertainty of whether supplies would reach the settlements. War was one more shadow in an already dark and difficult life. The people of Illinois were accustomed to hardship, but no one was prepared for the scale of loss that the summer of 1812 would bring. The climate that year was particularly cruel. The summer heat was unrelenting, baking the earth and drying up wells. Streams that once ran clear grew stagnant, their waters dark and foul-smelling. Insects bred rapidly in the heat, carrying disease from one child to another. Food supplies spoiled quickly, and malnutrition made young bodies weaker, less capable of fighting off even the mildest sickness. In such a world, a single outbreak of illness was like a match dropped in a forest of dry wood. It spread rapidly, consuming everything in its path. As the childcare home filled with more and more children, the conditions grew worse. Overcrowding meant less air, less food, and more chances for illness to pass from child to child. Coughs echoed through the halls, stomach pains doubled children over, and fevers burned hot across their tiny bodies. At first, the caretakers thought these were ordinary fevers, the kind that frontier families were all too familiar with. But soon it became clear this was something different, something deadlier. Children began to weaken rapidly, some too weak to stand, others slipping into silence after days of suffering. For the small community around the childcare home, this was a nightmare. Parents who had entrusted their children to the home came, in desperation, only to find rows of sick little ones, their eyes glassy, their lips cracked from dehydration. The caretakers were overwhelmed, powerless to stop what was happening. They tried herbs, prayer, and every remedy they had learned from mothers and grandmothers, but nothing worked. The illness moved faster than their efforts, claiming one child after another. To understand the depth of this tragedy, one must also understand the emotional fabric of frontier families. Children were not just children, they were the very center of family life, the hope for the future, the continuation of the lineage. Losing one child was devastating enough. Losing 45 in a single summer was an unthinkable horror, a wound that would never truly heal. For the families of Illinois, the childcare home, once a symbol of fragile hope, became a symbol of unbearable grief. And yet, despite the enormity of the loss, the tragedy did not echo far beyond the local community. News spread slowly in those days. Newspapers prioritized war updates, political speeches, and stories of national heroes. The cries of Illinois families did not make it to the front pages of distant cities. The war drowned out their grief. The history books that would later be written about 1812 mentioned battles, treaties, and presidents, but not the children who had died in the heat of an Illinois summer. It is easy to forget how silence shaped history in that time. There were no cameras to capture the rows of graves, no reporters to describe the tears of parents, no medical journals to study the outbreak. What remained were only fragments, whispers in family stories, notes in church registers, and the memories of those who lived through it. Over the years, even those fragments faded. Families moved on, generations passed, and the tragedy of 45 lost children slipped into the shadows, overshadowed by the noise of war and the march of progress. But silence does not erase pain. For the people who lived in that settlement, in 1812, the memory of the lost summer remained etched in their hearts. Every time a mother looked at the empty space where her child had once played, every time a father passed the graveyard where the little wooden crosses stood in a row, the weight of that summer pressed down on them. It was not just the loss of children, it was the loss of joy, the loss of hope, the loss of an entire generation of voices. This was Illinois in 1812, a land of promise, scarred by hardship, a territory caught between growth and grief, a community that built a home to protect its youngest, only to watch it become their final resting place. The stage was set, the conditions in place, for the heartbreaking story that would unfold in the months to come. And as we move deeper into this story, we must remember that every detail, every description, is not just about history. It is about real children, real families, and a tragedy that, though buried, deserves to be remembered. When we look back at the early years of the American frontier, we often imagine rugged independence, families surviving on their own in the wilderness, each cabin its own fortress against the elements. But the truth was far more complicated. Even the strongest families could be undone by sickness, by hunger, by a single failed harvest. In Illinois during 1812, the challenges were relentless, and not every parent had the strength or the resources to face them. For those who could not, a fragile solution arose: the creation of what would be called a child care home. The idea was born not from government decree or official organization, but from necessity, compassion, and desperation woven together. A group of local settlers, many of them women who had already faced the heartbreak of losing their own children, decided that something had to be done for the orphans and abandoned little ones in their community. Some children were left parentless by disease. Others had mothers widowed by accident or war, with no way to provide for them. And some were simply left behind by families too poor to feed one more mouth. The frontier was unforgiving, and choices that might seem unthinkable today were sometimes the only option for survival back then. The home itself was not grand. At first, it was simply a log building, rough-hewn timber stacked together, with a roof that leaked when the rains came too hard and walls that did little to hold back the winter cold. Inside, there were no fine beds, only straw pallets and blankets shared among multiple children. There was no organized system of care, no nurses or trained caregivers. The caretakers were mostly local women, widows, elderly settlers, or younger, mothers with a calling to protect children who had no one else. They gave what they could: food when they had it, attention when they were not overwhelmed, and faith when all else seemed lost. Despite its limitations, the home quickly became a beacon of hope. Word spread across settlements that there was a place, however humble, where children could find shelter. Parents facing impossible circumstances, too many mouths to feed, sudden illness, or the death of a spouse, began to bring their children to the home. Some came with tears, leaving behind their sons or daughters with a whispered promise that they would return. Others came quietly, slipping away in the night after dropping a child at the door, unable to face the guilt of their decision. Each child who entered carried a story, a history, and a longing for security. Inside the home, the children formed a kind of makeshift family. They came from different backgrounds, some the children of farmers, others the offspring of laborers or soldiers, but they shared the same need for warmth, food, and care. The older children often tried to take care of the younger ones, carrying them when they were too tired to walk, sharing their crumbs of bread, or rocking them to sleep when the nights grew restless. The caretakers encouraged this, knowing they could not possibly provide everything themselves. What grew in that home was a fragile sense of community, a fragile imitation of family life in a world that had taken so much away. The outside community viewed the home with mixed emotions. On one hand, it was admired, a place of compassion in a harsh world, evidence that even in the most difficult times, people still tried to care for the weakest among them. On the other hand, it was a reminder of failure. To leave a child there was to admit defeat, to confess that one could not provide. Some settlers whispered that it was shameful that a parent who truly cared would never surrender a child, no matter how hard life became. But those whispers did little to stop the flow of children into the home. Poverty silenced pride. Hunger silenced judgment. In the end, survival was the only thing that mattered. For the children themselves, the home was both comfort and hardship. Comfort, because they were no longer alone. They had others to play with, to share in their struggles. Hardship, because the resources were stretched thin, and the home could not meet the needs of so many. There were never enough blankets in winter, never enough food in summer, and always too little medicine when sickness swept through the halls. Still, the home represented something critical: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, some of the children would survive and grow to see a brighter future. It is important to understand that in 1812, this kind of organized childcare was almost unheard of on the frontier. Families were expected to take care of their own, and when they couldn't, the results were often grim. Children left orphaned sometimes wandered until someone took them in. Others fell victim to starvation, exposure, or worse. The very existence of this Illinois childcare home, however rudimentary, was remarkable in its own right. It reflected a community's attempt to rise above mere survival and to create a collective safety net, however fragile. But good intentions did not erase harsh reality. The building itself, crowded with dozens of children, quickly became a breeding ground for illness. With so many little bodies packed into close quarters, disease spread quickly. In a time before germ theory was understood, caretakers could not have known that their efforts to bring children together in safety were also exposing them to deadly contagions. Water drawn from nearby wells or rivers often carried bacteria. Invisible to the human eye and with no means to purify it, the children drank sickness with every cup. Food supplies donated by local farmers when they could spare it often ran short or spoiled. Malnutrition left the children weakened, their immune systems unable to withstand even the mildest fever. And yet, for all its flaws, parents still came. To them, the home was not a guarantee of survival, but it was at least a chance. For a mother too sick to rise from her bed, it was a place where her child might continue to live. For a father about to leave for war, it was a place where his children might be cared for until he returned. Even for those too poor to feed another mouth, it was a place where the child might not go hungry every single night. The decision was never easy, but often it was the only choice left. Inside those walls, moments of joy still existed. Children laughed together in play, even with empty stomachs. They shared songs they remembered from home, sang lullabies to each other, and invented games with sticks and stones. In their innocence, they created a small world where hope still flickered, even when everything around them seemed bleak. The caretakers, exhausted as they were, clung to these moments. They saw in those little faces the possibility of a better future, even if they themselves might never see it. The birth of the childcare home in Illinois was both an act of compassion and a symbol of desperation. It was born because families could not survive alone, because the frontier was too harsh, and because even in the face of overwhelming hardship, human beings refused to let children suffer without at least trying to help. It was imperfect, underfunded, overcrowded and fragile, but it was real. And for the community that built it, it was a source of both pride and sorrow. By the summer of 1812, the home was filled beyond its intended capacity. Dozens of children, each with a story, each with a family or a past, slept under the same roof. Parents continued to bring more, believing it was the only chance their children had. The caretakers struggled, doing everything they could to keep the little ones fed and alive. But outside, the world was changing. The heat of summer grew more intense, food grew scarcer, and whispers of sickness began to spread. No one knew it yet, but the very home built to save lives would soon become the site of one of the greatest losses in the community's history. The birth of the childcare home was a story of hope, but its destiny would become a story of devastation. What started as a dream of safety would soon turn into a nightmare that not even the most resilient frontier families could bear to remember without breaking. And as history moved forward, the home's name would fade, its records would scatter, and all that remained was the number. 45 children gone in a single summer, 45 lives extinguished where once there had been hope. The summer of 1812 in Illinois did not arrive gently. It swept in like a hammer, heavy and unrelenting, pressing its weight on the earth and every living thing upon it. The sun seemed to linger longer in the sky than usual, baking the prairies until the grasses turned brittle and brown. The air carried a thick, humid stillness that clung to skin and made breathing itself feel like labor. For the settlers of Illinois, heat was no stranger, but this particular summer was different. It was harsher, crueler, and, as it turned out, far deadlier. The childcare home, already strained by overcrowding and limited supplies, felt the suffocating heat more than most places. The building had been constructed of logs with little thought given to ventilation. Windows were few, small, and covered with oiled paper or thin cloth rather than glass. When the sun blazed high, the inside of the home transformed into an oven. Dozens of small bodies pressed together in cramped quarters produced even more heat. The air grew heavy, thick with sweat and the sour scent of illness. For children already weakened by hunger, the oppressive summer became an enemy that robbed them of strength before sickness even struck. Outside, the land itself seemed to revolt. Wells began to dry or yield only cloudy, brackish water. Streams that once gurgled with freshness slowed to a trickle, their beds exposed to the punishing sun. Families who had once relied on these water sources now faced a dire choice. Drink what was available and risk disease, or go without and risk death from thirst. The childcare home had little choice but to draw water wherever it could, even when the taste was foul and the color far from clear. The children drank, desperate for relief, but with every swallow they invited invisible dangers into their bodies. The settlers noticed early that summer that sickness seemed to hover in the air. Even before the childcare home saw its first case, nearby families whispered of fevers, of stomach pains that came suddenly and violently, of neighbors bedridden for days until their bodies could endure no more. In an age without understanding of bacteria or viruses, such illnesses were explained in other ways. Some blamed bad air, the so-called miasmas, that were believed to rise from swamps and stagnant pools. Others saw divine punishment, a test of faith, or the consequence of hidden sins. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same. Once illness entered a household, it spread with frightening speed. Inside the childcare home, the first signs were easy to miss. A child grew pale and listless, refusing to play, appetite gone. Another developed a fever, sweating through the night as the caretakers whispered prayers and wiped small foreheads with damp cloths. At first it seemed ordinary. After all, children grew sick often in those days. But the heat, the lack of fresh air, and the closeness of so many little bodies turned ordinary sickness into something far more dangerous. Soon, it was not just one or two who lay ill, but a dozen. Then more. Coughs echoed through the rooms, children doubled over with stomach cramps. The sound of vomiting and the smell of sickness filled the cramped quarters. The caretakers tried everything they knew. They brewed teas from herbs gathered in the woods, applied poultices to the children's chests, whispered lullabies through the long nights, and prayed without ceasing. But nothing slowed the spread. One child weakened until their breathing became shallow, then stopped altogether. Another followed soon after. The caretakers, already overwhelmed, dug small graves on the edge of the settlement, their tears mingling with the dirt as they lowered the tiny bodies into the ground. For the community, each death struck like a thunderclap. Parents who had left their children at the home rushed to the building when they heard rumors of sickness, only to find the halls filled with pale, feverish faces. Some tried to take their children back home, believing they might be safer there. Others stayed, helpless, because they could offer no better care on their own. The home had been meant as a place of safety, but now it felt more like a trap, its walls holding in the sickness as surely as they had once held out the cold. The summer sun did not relent. Day after day, the heat bore down, weakening everyone. Food spoiled quickly and flies swarmed over every meal. Water grew scarcer, and even when it was found, it often carried the sickness deeper into the children's frail bodies. With every passing week, more small voices fell silent. The laughter that had once echoed through the home was replaced by moans of pain, the sound of coughing, and the occasional eerie quiet of exhaustion. The caretakers, once hopeful, now moved through the halls like shadows, their faces etched with grief as they realized they were losing far more children than they could save. By midsummer, the toll had become undeniable. Dozens of children lay sick, and many had already been buried. 45 would be gone before the summer ended. Imagine for a moment what that number meant to the settlement. In a community that might only number a couple hundred people, losing 45 children was like watching an entire generation erased in a matter of months. Every family was touched, every heart was broken. The graveyard grew crowded with small markers, each one a testament to dreams cut short. What made the tragedy even more unbearable was its speed. Parents who had brought their children to the home in May with hope returned in July or August to find graves instead of smiles. Some mothers collapsed at the sight, screaming and clawing at the earth as if they could somehow pull their child back. Fathers, hardened by years of survival, wept openly, their shoulders shaking as they stood before the fresh mounds of dirt. The grief was not quiet, it was loud, raw, and uncontainable. Yet beyond the settlement, the world hardly noticed. The War of 1812 dominated every newspaper, every piece of correspondence that traveled east. Politicians debated strategies, generals clashed on battlefields, and cities worried about invasions. What was 45 children in Illinois compared to the burning of Washington, compared to the clash of armies? To the larger world, it was nothing more than a whisper, easily drowned out by the roar of war. But to those families, it was everything. It was the collapse of their future, the shattering of their hearts, and the kind of loss that leaves scars for generations. And yet, despite the magnitude of the loss, the survivors carried on, because they had no choice. The caretakers buried the dead, comforted the living, and tried desperately to prevent more from joining the growing ranks of graves. They kept tending to the sick, even as their own health faltered, even as exhaustion dragged at their bodies. They prayed louder, hoping for a miracle, but the heat showed no mercy, and the sickness refused to stop. By the time the summer waned and the first cool breezes of autumn began to drift across the prairies, the damage was done. 45 children were gone, their lives stolen not by war, not by violence, but by the cruel partnership of heat, disease, and neglect born of poverty and ignorance. Their names were written in church registers, perhaps, or remembered in family Bibles, but history at large would not record them. They were too small, their voices too quiet, their lives too short. And so, outside of the families who mourned them, the tragedy of the summer of 1812 faded into silence. But silence does not mean absence. Every parent who lived through that summer carried the weight forever. Every sibling who grew up in the shadow of that loss remembered the laughter that never returned. Every caretaker who had tried and failed carried guilt like a stone in their chest, and though history books turned their attention elsewhere, the grief lingered, hidden in the corners of memory, waiting for someone to uncover it again. The summer of 1812 was more than just a season. It was a trial by fire for the community, a cruel reminder of how fragile life was on the frontier and how quickly hope could turn into horror. It was the season that transformed a humble childcare home into a place of mourning, a summer when the sun did not bless the land but scorched it, leaving behind scars that no amount of time could ever fully heal. At first, no one believed that what was happening inside the childcare home would grow into something catastrophic. Children had always fallen ill from time to time. On the frontier, fever, coughing, stomach pains and rashes were all part of life. Parents learned to endure these things the way they endured storms or bitter winters, accepting that some would survive and some would not. But as the summer of 1812 pressed forward, the illnesses inside the home began to show a strange and frightening pattern. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with 1 or 2 children refusing their food. A small boy, once lively and playful, sat slumped in the corner, his eyes glazed and his energy drained. A little girl who had been singing to the younger ones suddenly coughed so hard that she could not catch her breath. The caretakers noticed, but they did not panic. These were the kinds of things they had seen before. A fever would break, a cough would fade, and life would go on. But these were not ordinary fevers. The first signs of real danger came in the children's eyes. Where once there had been light and curiosity, there was now only dullness, as if something was dimming from within. Their small hands trembled when they tried to hold cups of water. Some of them could not even rise from their straw mats, their bodies too weak to support them. When the first child died, the caretakers told themselves it was an isolated case. The little boy had been weak before, perhaps malnourished or already sick when he arrived. But then another child followed, and then another. The sound of coughing filled the home, echoing through the cramped wooden walls. At night, the caretakers were unable to sleep for the cries that pierced the darkness. Cries of pain, cries of thirst, cries of fear. They moved from bed to bed, from mat to mat, wiping brows with damp cloths, whispering prayers, and urging the children to hold on. The older children tried to help, carrying cups of water to the younger ones, patting their backs when they struggled to breathe, or simply lying close to comfort them. It was a scene of innocence fighting against despair, of little ones taking on the role of caretakers when the adults themselves were overwhelmed. The parents who visited the home noticed the change as well. At first, they told themselves it was just the summer heat, that the children would recover once cooler weather arrived. But as the weeks went on, their visits grew more frantic. They arrived to find their children pale and thin, their once lively voices reduced to weak whispers. Some parents tried to take their children back, believing they might fare better at home, but others knew they had nothing to offer. No food, no medicine, no hope beyond what the home already gave. And so they watched, helpless, as the sickness spread like a shadow across every corner of the building. The first deaths created ripples of fear that spread far beyond the childcare home. In small communities, news traveled fast. People spoke in hushed voices at church gatherings and around dinner tables. They asked one another if it was safe to bring children near the home, if the illness might spread beyond its walls, if perhaps God himself was punishing them. Some settlers suggested closing the home entirely, sending the children back to their families or scattering them among households. Others argued that doing so would only spread the sickness further, turning one tragedy into many, and so the home remained, both sanctuary and prison, its walls holding in both hope and despair. The caretakers themselves were caught in an impossible struggle. They could not abandon the children, yet they knew they were fighting a battle they were ill-equipped to win. They had no medicine, no doctors, and no understanding of what was killing the little ones so quickly. They turned to the remedies they knew, herbs boiled into bitter teas, poultices pressed against burning skin, cool rags dipped in the little water they had left. They whispered prayers over each child, calling on God to show mercy. Sometimes, a fever would break, and for a brief moment, hope would return. But then the child would relapse, weaker than before, and within days another small body was carried to the graveyard. The children themselves seemed to sense what was happening, though they could not fully understand it. They grew quieter, clinging to one another in the long, hot nights. The younger ones asked when their parents would return, when the fevers would end, when they would be able to play outside again. The older ones did not answer, for they too were frightened. In the dim light of the evenings, the home no longer rang with laughter or chatter. Instead, it echoed with coughing, with whispers of prayer, and with the silence that came after another child was lost. Outside, the summer pressed on, indifferent to the suffering within the home. The sun scorched the fields, making food harder to grow. Water grew fouler with each passing day, forcing the caretakers to choose between thirst and sickness. Families in the wider community struggled too, and some began to fear the home as a cursed place. They spoke of spirits, of divine wrath, of the sins of the settlers bringing judgment upon them. Fear wrapped itself around grief until the childcare home, once a fragile symbol of compassion, became a place many dreaded to even approach. Yet even in the midst of fear, love endured. Some mothers came daily to sit outside the home, unable to enter because of their own illness or weakness, but unwilling to leave their children alone. Fathers worked long hours in the fields, only to return and stand in silence near the home, as if their presence alone could shield their sons and daughters from the invisible enemy stalking them. Caretakers continued their thankless vigil, refusing to abandon the children even when they themselves grew sick. The first signs of the tragedy were not just in the fevers and deaths, but in the weary eyes of those who stayed, eyes that had seen too much loss, and yet still refused to turn away. By late June, the tragedy was undeniable. The first signs had become a storm, sweeping away every fragile defense the home had tried to raise. The illness no longer took days to spread from child to child. It moved almost overnight, as if the air itself carried it. The caretakers counted each death with breaking hearts, digging graves with their own hands because no one else would. The graveyard filled quickly, each new mound of earth a reminder of how little they could do. And yet they went on, clinging to the faint hope that the next child might survive, that perhaps the sickness would finally pass. But it did not pass. The first signs were only the beginning. What lay ahead was far worse. A tidal wave of grief and death that would leave the home and the community forever scarred. The whispers of fear would become cries of anguish. The trickle of graves would become a flood. And the summer of 1812 would be remembered not for its heat, not for its harvest, not even for the war raging far away, but for the countless small lives lost within the walls of a home that was supposed to protect them. By the time July arrived, the rhythm of life inside the childcare home had been transformed into something unrecognizable. What had once been a place filled with chatter and play now resembled a sick ward where every breath felt uncertain. The children no longer gathered in groups to laugh or share stories. They lay scattered across straw mats and wooden floors, their faces pale, their lips cracked, and their small bodies trembling under the strain of unending fever. The heat outside was unbearable, but the heat inside, trapped between the walls, seemed almost suffocating. Even the caretakers could hardly draw breath without feeling the weight of it. Day after day, the numbers grew worse. Where once it had been a handful of children lying sick, now it seemed that nearly all of them were suffering in some way. The strongest tried to rise, to fetch water for the younger ones, to sit beside those too weak to move, but even they soon collapsed, their energy drained. Some could not keep down even a sip of water. Others shivered despite the burning air, their bodies racked with chills. The air was filled with the sound of coughing, groaning, and the weak, desperate whimpers of children calling out for mothers and fathers who could not always come. The caretakers worked themselves to exhaustion. They moved from child to child, wiping sweat from fevered brows, coaxing them to drink, singing softly in hopes of easing their pain. But their hands were not enough. They lacked medicine, they lacked clean water, they lacked food that would nourish instead of spoil. Their knowledge, drawn from old remedies and half-remembered traditions, failed them at every turn. And still, they did not stop. Even as their own bodies ached and their eyes burned from sleepless nights, they remained at the children's sides, determined to fight the sickness with nothing more than their presence and their prayers. Outside the walls of the home, the community grew restless. Word of the mounting death spread quickly. Families whispered about what was happening, sometimes in fear, sometimes in anger. Some said the home was cursed, that it should be abandoned before the sickness consumed everyone. Others insisted it was the water, that the wells themselves had turned against them. A few claimed the illness was carried in the air, a punishment for sins they could not name. Fear is a powerful thing, and as more graves appeared on the edge of the settlement, fear became as contagious as the sickness itself. The caretakers faced not only the relentless illness, but also the suspicion of their neighbors. When parents came to visit and found their children growing weaker, they sometimes lashed out in grief, accusing the caretakers of neglect or even of bringing the sickness into the home. Harsh words were exchanged, tears were shed, and still, the caretakers had no answers to give. They were as helpless as the families, trapped in the same storm of sorrow. All they could do was continue digging graves and wiping brows, their hands rough from work, their hearts heavy with guilt they did not deserve. Each burial became a ritual of heartbreak. The ground near the settlement grew crowded with small mounds of earth, each one marked by a wooden cross or a simple stone. Parents stood over these graves, their cries filling the summer air, their grief raw and unrestrained. For every child buried, another fell ill, and it seemed the cycle would never end. The caretakers themselves carried the small bodies to the earth when families could not bear the weight, their arms trembling not from strength, but from the knowledge that they were carrying away futures that would never be. Inside the home, the atmosphere was changing in another way too. The children who were still able to speak began to ask questions the caretakers could not answer. They wanted to know why so many of their friends had gone, why they felt so weak, whether they too would soon be buried under the hot prairie sun. Some clung to hope, whispering to one another that they would get better, that they would live to see the cool winds of autumn. Others grew quiet, their eyes distant, as if they already knew their time was short. In their innocence, they carried an understanding that the adults themselves could not put into words. By the middle of summer, the losses were so heavy that the sound of mourning became a constant presence in the community. Families no longer spoke of if they would lose a child, but when. Even those whose children were not in the home lived in dread, for they knew the sickness could spread at any moment. Every cough, every fever, every sign of weakness brought waves of panic. The war, raging in the east, seemed impossibly far away. The only battle that mattered here was the one against a sickness no one could see or fight. The caretakers found themselves caught between despair and duty. Some nights they broke down, weeping quietly when they thought no one could hear. But when the sun rose, they wiped their eyes and carried on, because the children needed them. They sang lullabies even when their own voices cracked. They whispered prayers even when their faith wavered. They carried buckets of foul water even when their hands bled from the effort. Their lives had become a cycle of care, grief, and exhaustion, repeated endlessly in the sweltering heat. Every death added another weight to their hearts. They remembered each face, each laugh, each small hand that had once reached for theirs. The memories of healthy, happy children haunted them as they watched more fall ill. Some began to wonder if they were cursed, if perhaps their efforts had only trapped the children in a place where sickness could devour them more quickly, yet they could not abandon them. To leave would be to give up entirely, and that they could not do. As July turned toward August, the home was no longer a place of safety at all. It had become a place defined by shadows and silence. The surviving children barely spoke. Their games and songs had disappeared, replaced by a stillness that was almost unbearable. The caretakers could feel the weight of history pressing on them, though they could not have named it as such. They only knew they were witnessing something larger than themselves, something that would not be forgotten by those who lived through it. The community too began to realize that what was happening was not just a passing sickness, but a tragedy unlike any they had ever seen. 45 children in a single summer. It was a number so staggering that some could not believe it. Others refused to speak of it at all, as if silence might somehow undo the truth. But silence could not undo the rows of graves, nor could it erase the memories of the cries that echoed through the summer nights. In time, the world outside would turn its attention elsewhere, to the war and to other matters of survival. But within the settlement, the memory of that summer would never fade. It was etched into every family who had lost a child, into every caretaker who had watched over the dying, into every parent who had stood beside a fresh grave. It was not just an event. It was a wound that reshaped the very identity of the community. The summer of 1812 became the marker by which life was measured, before the sickness and after it. And so, as the days dragged on and the heat finally began to soften, the tragedy remained. The grave stood silent testimony to what had been lost, and the survivors carried on with hearts broken but unbowed. The childcare home, once a fragile beacon of hope, now bore the weight of sorrow so great that it seemed impossible to continue. Yet life, in its cruel persistence, would move forward, carrying the scars of that summer into every season that followed. As the summer neared its end, the childcare home no longer resembled what it had once been. The laughter of children was gone, replaced by a quiet so heavy that even the creak of the wooden floorboards seemed unbearable. What remained inside were shadows of what had been, memories etched into every corner. The surviving children, fewer and weaker than before, rarely spoke. Their eyes had the hollow look of those who had seen too much, who had carried grief far beyond their years. They no longer asked about the friends they had lost. They already knew the answers. The caretakers moved through the building like ghosts themselves, drained of everything but the stubborn will to keep going. They had buried so many small bodies that their hands trembled each time they touched another child, afraid of what the next hour might bring. Every blanket, every cup, every corner of the home seemed to hold the scent of illness and loss. At night, when they finally rested their weary heads, their dreams were filled with faces of children calling out to them, asking why they had not been saved. No prayer seemed strong enough to quiet those voices. The community outside the home carried its own burdens. Entire families were scarred. Parents who had lost children moved through their days with vacant stares, their grief raw and unspoken. Some avoided the home entirely, unable to look at the place that had become both sanctuary and graveyard. Others lingered outside its walls, unable to stay away, as if being near the site of their children's last moments might bring them closer to those they had lost. Every Sunday at church, the empty spaces in the pews told the story that words could not. The absence was louder than any hymn. Neighbors spoke of the tragedy in hushed tones. Some asked whether the home should ever have existed at all. Others said that without it, even more children would have perished in scattered huts and cabins, alone and unseen. But almost everyone agreed on one thing: nothing would ever feel the same again. The land itself seemed to carry the sorrow as though the summer sun had seared the grief into the soil. Even the wind across the prairie felt different, heavier, carrying whispers of loss that no one dared speak too loudly. For the surviving children, recovery was slow and uncertain. Their bodies bore the marks of what they had endured: thin frames, lingering coughs, and eyes that seemed too old for their age. But the greater wounds were invisible. Some flinched at every cough or cry, haunted by memories of friends fading beside them. Others clung desperately to any sign of comfort, unwilling to let go of the caretakers who had stood beside them in the darkest days. Their innocence had been fractured, and though they were alive, a part of them remained in the graves alongside those they had loved. The caretakers, too, struggled with guilt that never fully lifted. They asked themselves over and over, could they have done more? Should they have closed the home when the sickness began? Should they have turned children back to their families, even if it risked spreading the illness further? These questions became a constant echo in their minds, a torment that refused to fade. Some left the settlement altogether, unable to bear the weight of memory. Others stayed, carrying their grief like a second skin, determined to care for whoever remained, because abandoning them felt like betrayal. As autumn arrived and the heat of summer finally broke, the sickness seemed to fade. But the silence it left behind was more chilling than the fevers had been. The graveyard by the settlement stood as an undeniable record, rows of fresh mounds that no one could ignore. Every passerby saw them and remembered. Every family that laid flowers at those graves carried the ache into the next season. It became impossible to talk of the year without mentioning the tragedy. Life was divided now into before and after, and no amount of harvest or prayer could erase the line. Some settlers tried to find meaning in the loss. They said it was God's test, that the community must endure suffering to be made stronger. Others whispered darker theories, insisting the tragedy was a punishment for sins or for the arrogance of trying to gather so many children under one roof. A few blamed the war that raged in the east, convinced that soldiers moving through the region had carried some unseen plague into their midst, but most spoke little at all. The weight of grief was too heavy for explanations. Silence became the language of survival. Yet even in silence, small acts of resilience appeared. Families shared what little food they had with the caretakers, no longer seeing them as failures, but as fellow mourners. Survivors began to gather together, holding one another through the long nights when memories returned too sharply. Some, mothers who had lost children, began caring for those who remained, giving their grief direction by pouring love into lives still fragile and uncertain. In this way, the tragedy reshaped not only the home, but the entire community. Bonds of sorrow grew into bonds of solidarity. Still, no one could deny that the tragedy left scars too deep to fully heal. The home itself bore them in every plank of wood and every stone in its foundation. It had been built as a place of hope, yet it had become a place of mourning. The surviving children carried those scars in their hearts, shaping the adults they would later become. And the caretakers, haunted as they were, could never look at their work the same way again. The question of whether their efforts had saved anyone or merely prolonged suffering would follow them for the rest of their lives. Years later, when stories of the war and of the frontier's hardships filled history books, the tragedy of that summer would remain mostly buried, remembered only in whispers and in family stories passed down through generations. But for those who had lived through it, no record was needed. They carried the memory in their bones, in their grief, in the empty chairs at their tables. The childcare home was never forgotten, even if the world outside never fully knew. The weight of 45 small lives lost in a single season was too heavy to fade. The prairie wind would continue to blow, the seasons would turn, and new children would be born into the settlement. Life, relentless as ever, would move forward. But underneath it all, the shadow of that summer remained. It lingered in the soil, in the songs sung at gravesides, in the quiet prayers whispered at night. It was a reminder of how fragile life could be, of how quickly hope could turn to despair, and of how deeply a community could be reshaped by grief. And though time would dull the sharpness of the pain, it could never erase it. The childcare home of Illinois in 1812 would forever be remembered, not as the safe haven it had tried to be, but as the place where 45 children were lost, where innocence was stolen, and where an entire community learned the terrible cost of a summer they could never escape. When the leaves began to turn that autumn, the childcare home stood in silence, its walls heavy with the memories of the summer's sorrow. The children who remained lived on, but they were not the same children who had once filled the rooms with laughter. Their steps were slower, their voices softer, and their eyes seemed older than their years. Each one carried not only the weight of their own survival, but also the unspoken knowledge that dozens of their friends had not been as fortunate. Their games felt half-hearted, their laughter tinged with hesitation, as though joy itself had become something dangerous, something fragile that might vanish at any moment. The caretakers who had endured that summer struggled to move forward. Though their hands were no longer busy with fevers and burials, their hearts remained restless. In quiet moments they found themselves staring at empty beds, remembering faces that would never return. Some could not walk past the small graves without weeping, while others avoided the burial ground entirely, unable to confront the row upon row of reminders. In their minds, the cries of sick children echoed still, and no amount of time seemed enough to silence those sounds. The community tried to heal, but healing was not simple. Families who had lost children walked with invisible burdens that set them apart from others. They gathered together in grief, comforting one another in ways outsiders could not. Their homes became quieter, their days marked by absences that could not be filled. For many, every ordinary moment, supper at the table, prayers before bed, chores in the fields, was pierced by the memory of a child who should have been there. That sense of incompleteness became a constant companion. As winter approached, the harsh winds of the prairie forced people indoors, where silence deepened. The sickness no longer raged, but its aftermath lingered in whispers and in the weight of unspoken thoughts. At church, preachers spoke of endurance, of God's will, of the promise that suffering would not last forever. But for the parents who sat in the pews with empty arms, these words often rang hollow. Faith had been tested, and though some clung more fiercely to it, others found themselves doubting whether divine mercy could exist in a world where so many innocent lives had been taken. The surviving children faced a different struggle. Their bodies recovered slowly, but their minds carried scars invisible to most. Nightmares plagued them, filled with images of friends coughing, of caretakers weeping, of graves being dug. Some woke screaming, unable to explain what haunted them. Others withdrew, speaking little, as if words themselves had lost meaning. A few clung obsessively to caretakers or older siblings, terrified of being left alone. Childhood for them had ended abruptly, replaced by a kind of haunted watchfulness that followed them into every new season. Among the caretakers, disagreements quietly simmered. Some believed the home should be closed, that it had become tainted by tragedy and would never again serve as a safe haven. Others argued that to abandon it would mean admitting defeat, that the only way to honor the lost children was to continue caring for those who remained. The debates rarely grew loud, but they revealed the fractures in hearts already fragile. Ultimately, the home remained, not because anyone truly believed it could be what it once was, but because no one had the strength to dismantle it. It stood as both shelter and monument, a building bound to grief yet stubbornly still alive. As the years passed, the tragedy began to take on the shape of memory, though never fading completely. New children were born into the settlement. New families moved in, and the rhythm of daily life returned in some ways. The war in the East continued, and news of battles and political upheaval drifted across the frontier. But within the community, the summer of 1812 remained the defining story. Parents told younger children about the brothers and sisters they had lost, their voices filled with a mixture of sorrow and reverence. Some told the story to warn, to remind their children of the fragility of life. Others told it in whispers, reluctant but unable to remain silent, as if speaking the memory aloud gave it shape and prevented it from slipping into nothingness. The survivors carried their memories into adulthood. Some grew determined to build stronger, healthier lives for their own families, ensuring that no child under their care would suffer as they had once suffered. They became parents who hovered protectively, always alert for the first sign of illness. Others carried a quieter pain, unable to fully open their hearts, always fearing that love would be followed by loss. In both ways, the tragedy shaped them, molding the adults they became and influencing the next generation. For the caretakers who remained, their lives were marked forever by the memory of the children they had lost. In old age, some spoke of that summer as the most painful chapter of their lives, confessing that no matter what they had done, it had never felt like enough. They remembered the faces of every child who had passed, names etched into their hearts as though carved into stone. Their memories became oral histories, passed down to others so that the story would not be forgotten, even as years turned to decades. The graves by the settlement grew weathered with time, wooden markers fading, stones sinking into the earth. Grass grew thick over the mounds and wildflowers bloomed where children had once played. Yet for those who knew, each hillock of earth remained sacred ground. Families tended them quietly, placing tokens and whispers of love upon the soil. For strangers, the burial ground might have appeared ordinary, but for the community it was a constant reminder. 45 small lives lost in one summer, a loss so vast it had reshaped their world. As decades passed, memory turned to legend. The story of the childcare home spread beyond the settlement, told in fragments, sometimes distorted, but always marked by the weight of sorrow. Outsiders heard of the tragedy and shook their heads, speaking of it as one of many frontier hardships. But for those whose lives had been intertwined with it, the story was not a lesson in history, it was a wound that never closed. Even generations later, descendants carried the echoes of that summer. Some grew up with stories of siblings or cousins they had never met, their names whispered like prayers. Others visited the graves without fully knowing the details, standing in silence where their ancestors had once wept. In this way, the tragedy stretched across time, binding families together through shared memory. The childcare home itself eventually fell into disrepair. The walls cracked, the roof sagged, and vines crept across the wood. It stood for many years as a silent witness, abandoned but never entirely forgotten. Travelers who passed by sometimes asked about it, and the locals would explain, their voices heavy with the story. The building became a ghost of sorts, a symbol of both hope and heartbreak, lingering long after its purpose had ended. And so, though the world moved forward, the shadow of that summer never truly disappeared. It lingered in the soil, in the hearts of survivors, in the whispered stories passed down through generations. The tragedy of the 45 children was not written in books, nor carved into monuments, but it was written in memory, in grief, and in the very identity of those who lived on. To speak of Illinois in 1812 was to speak of that summer, of the lives lost, and of the way a single season had reshaped a community forever. Time has a strange way of reshaping tragedy. What once feels unbearable in the moment gradually becomes memory, and then memory becomes story, and eventually even the sharpest pain can be softened by the passing of years. Yet there are some stories that resist complete erasure, lingering in whispers even when official records remain silent. The child care home in Illinois during the summer of 1812 became one of those stories, carried more by grief-stricken voices than by ink on paper. The year itself was already marked by chaos. The War of 1812 had erupted, drawing attention eastward toward battles between Britain and America, toward soldiers marching and ships clashing. Newspapers filled their pages with reports of skirmishes, declarations, and political debates. In such times, a small settlement in Illinois hardly seemed to matter to the nation at large. Families who lost children in the home found their grief overshadowed by the roar of war, their private tragedy drowned beneath headlines that spoke of national destiny. This silence was not only born of neglect, it was also born of choice. Communities that suffered so deeply often hesitated to share their pain with outsiders. To speak of the 45 children lost in one summer was to expose wounds too raw, to admit a kind of helplessness that frontier families could scarcely bear to acknowledge. On the edge of survival, settlers needed to believe in their resilience, their strength, their ability to endure. To speak openly of such devastation would have been to shatter that image. And so, the tragedy became an inward story, spoken in kitchens, in quiet gatherings, at gravesides, but rarely beyond. Yet the absence of official record does not mean the event faded from memory. Within the community, it became a defining reference point. Elders spoke of the summer when nearly an entire generation of children was swept away. They used the story to warn of the dangers of disease, to remind the young not to take health for granted, to instill caution and reverence for the fragility of life. In some ways, the memory of the tragedy became a tool for survival, shaping how later generations approached hardship. Still, history written for the wider world rarely makes room for stories like these. Grand battles, political decisions, and economic progress take center stage, while the quiet suffering of small communities disappears into the margins. The child care home of 1812 became one of those margins, tucked away in oral tradition rather than official accounts. To historians, it might appear only as a brief reference in a diary or a passing mention in a letter. But for the families who lived it, the tragedy remained central, shaping identities and silences for generations to come. Part of the reason it remained hidden was the shame attached to it. Caretakers who had done everything in their power still blamed themselves. Families who entrusted their children to the home wondered if they had made the wrong choice. Even survivors who carried on with their lives sometimes felt a guilt too heavy to voice. In such an atmosphere, there was little appetite for public commemoration. The graves stood as testimony enough. They did not need monuments. The land itself bore the memory. Over time, new generations grew up hearing fragments of the story, never the whole. They knew that something terrible had happened, that dozens of children had been lost, but the details were often blurred by silence. Grandparents hesitated to relive the full pain, and so children received only pieces. Names of siblings they never met, a story about illness sweeping through the prairie, a reminder that the land carried sorrow. These fragments became folklore of a sort, shaping the way the community thought of itself without ever being written into textbooks. By the mid-19th century, the prairie had changed. Railroads carved through the land, towns grew, and the frontier slowly gave way to settlement. The childcare home itself decayed, its timbers rotting, its roof sagging, until only ruins remained. To travelers passing by, it looked like any abandoned structure, a relic of another time. Few could imagine the weight of sorrow it had once held. Yet for those whose families had lived through it, the ruins were more than wood and stone. They were haunted ground. Some avoided it altogether, while others felt drawn to it, as if standing within its remains kept the memory alive. In the broader narrative of American history, the tragedy never appeared. It was too local, too personal, too small in scale compared to wars and politics. But the absence of recognition does not mean it lacked importance. For the people who carried it, the loss of 45 children in one summer was a devastation, greater than any battle reported in the newspapers. It shaped the emotional landscape of the settlement in ways outsiders could never measure. And perhaps that is one of the reasons the story lingered as it did. In the private spaces, in the quiet silences, in the rituals of remembrance that took place out of sight. The tragedy of 1812 was never meant to be displayed as a grand lesson for the nation. It was carried instead as a sacred memory, passed from voice to voice, bound by love and grief. In this way, the story resisted erasure. Even without monuments or books, it endured, because those who had lived through it could not let it go. When historians look back on the early 19th century, they often focus on expansion, conflict, and growth. But beneath those grand narratives lies another layer, the human cost, the fragile lives lost in places too small to command attention. The childcare home of Illinois was one of those hidden costs, an invisible thread in the fabric of American history. Though absent from the grand story, it shaped the people who lived it, and through them, it shaped the generations that followed. The graves remain, even if unmarked or forgotten by the world at large. Beneath the earth lie 45 children whose lives ended too soon, who never grew into the adults they might have been. Their names may be lost to history, but their story is not. It lingers in whispers, in fragments, in the sorrow that still clings to the land. And though the world may move on, the tragedy remains a reminder. History is not only the tale of nations, but also the tale of small communities, of grief carried in silence, of love marked by loss. The story of the childcare home that lost 45 children in one summer is not just about the past. It is about the way tragedy ripples through time, shaping generations long after the graves have settled and the cries have faded. To hear it now, centuries later, is to be reminded of the fragility of life, of how quickly joy can be stolen, and of how communities carry their pain in silence. It is a story that speaks not only of death, but also of survival, resilience, and the quiet determination of human hearts to endure even when broken. When we look back at 1812, we often imagine war drums, soldiers marching, politicians making decisions that would shape the course of the nation. But while the nation's destiny unfolded on battlefields and in halls of power, another destiny unfolded in a small settlement in Illinois. One measured not in treaties or victories, but in the lives of children who never grew old. Their absence is a kind of negative space in history, a reminder that for every grand event we record, countless personal tragedies remain unwritten. The children themselves, though gone, are not lost in the truest sense. Their lives echo in the memories of those who loved them, in the stories passed down, in the very soil where they rest. They live on in the way survivors remembered their laughter, their games, their voices. They live on in the cautionary tales told to later generations, in the reverence that families held for the burial ground, in the persistent silence that covered the community like a veil. Even now, to speak of them is to give them presence once again, to remind the world that they existed, that they mattered. For the caretakers, the tragedy became a burden carried until death. Their lives were marked by what had happened, their identities forever tied to that summer. And yet, despite their grief, they chose to continue caring, to continue living, to continue creating some semblance of hope for the children who survived. Their resilience, though often unspoken, was itself a testament to love. A love that refused to be extinguished even in the face of overwhelming loss. The families who lost children bore scars that words can scarcely capture. No monument could ever measure the depth of their grief. No sermon could ever soothe the ache of absence. Yet their endurance speaks volumes. They planted crops, raised new children, and carried on not because they forgot, but because they knew life demanded it. To carry on was not betrayal of the lost. It was the only way to honor them. The only way to ensure that the settlement itself did not die with those 45 small lives. And what of us, who listen to this story now, long after the graves have settled and the settlement has changed, beyond recognition? We are left with a choice. We can dismiss it as just another forgotten tragedy, one of countless sorrows buried in history. Or we can pause, reflect, and allow it to shape us. We can recognize that the past is not simply dates and wars, but people, fragile, ordinary, sometimes forgotten, but always real. Each of those children had a name, a face, a laugh, dreams that will never be known. To remember them is to honor them. In the telling of this story lies a kind of redemption. History did not grant these children a place in its grand narrative. Their names were not carved into stone monuments, their lives not chronicled in books. But in speaking of them now, we carve a space for them in memory. We restore in some small way the dignity that silence denied them. We acknowledge that their lives, though brief, mattered as much as any general, any politician, any hero whose deeds were recorded. The tragedy also asks us to reflect on our present. In a world still shaped by loss, disease, and hardship, we are reminded that behind every statistic are lives just as real, just as precious. Numbers can numb us, but stories reawaken our humanity. When we say 45 children, it is easy to see only a number. But when we imagine the faces, the laughter, the games, the futures never realized, the number becomes unbearable, and that is the truth of tragedy. It is always larger than the sum of its parts, always deeper than we can easily comprehend. The home itself may have decayed, the wood turned to dust, the roof collapsed into the earth, but its memory remains. It remains in the whispered stories of descendants, in the faded markers of graves, in the very air of Illinois where the tragedy once unfolded. It remains in the act of telling here and now, centuries later. Perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of all, that memory, though fragile, can survive if we choose to carry it. In closing, let us imagine those children not as victims defined only by their deaths, but as lives that burned brightly, however briefly. They were sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, friends and companions. They ran through fields, they laughed in the sun, they played games that echoed with joy. Though their summer ended in sorrow, their existence was filled with moments of life, of love, of hope. And it is those moments just as much as the tragedy that deserve to be remembered. The childcare home that lost 45 children in one summer is more than a buried American tragedy. It is a mirror held up to the fragility of life, the endurance of grief, and the resilience of memory. As long as the story is told, they are not forgotten. Their voices may no longer be heard, but their echoes remain, calling us to listen, to care, to remember. And so, as we step away from this story, we carry with us not only the weight of loss, but also the responsibility of remembrance. For in remembrance lies a kind of justice, and in telling the story, we ensure that the children of Illinois in 1812 live on, not as numbers, not as shadows, but as human beings who once were and who deserve never to be erased.